This is Biology 160, Introduction to Anatomy and Physiology on the Lymphatic System. We're now going to talk a little bit about cell-mediated immunity, or the immune response. This is the one that deals with the T cells as opposed to the B cells. There's a few major differences between cell-mediated immunity versus the humoral immune response that we talked about with the B cells. And the B cells, to remind you about what we talked about there, the B cells have receptors on the outside of their cells that attach to antigens, and they're able to attach directly to the antigens. In cell-mediated immune response, things are a little bit different. So the T cells, they can't directly attach to antigens that are just floating around in the body. Instead, there's an interesting situation here where these antigens have to be presented by other cells, and these cells are the macrophages. So what happens here is the macrophages will engulf an antigen, and then they'll present it. That antigen will end up on the plasma membrane on the outside of the cell, and it'll present itself to the T cells. So this is for example, this macrophage may be traveling around the body. These are the white blood cells that'll eat things, phagocytize things. So they'll phagocytize a bacteria, and then they'll take the antigens on that bacteria and present it on the outside of their cell. Then the T cells come up and they attach to the macrophages, but they must recognize what they say, non-self and self. So this is like a double handshake, is how they sometimes explain this. Not only does it have to connect to the antigen of the foreign substance, but it also has to recognize the macrophage as self. So it has to recognize self and self, and then, only then is it activated and starts forming clones and begins this part of the response. So here's an example here. So here is our macrophage over here. This is our macrophage. It has engulfed an antigen. It processes those antigens. Then it presents it here on the outside of the cell. Here we have a helper T cell that comes and it recognizes that antigen there, and that's going to activate the cell-mediated immunity, or the T cells. It also will activate B cells as well. So helper T cells will work in both these ways here. So the cell-mediated immune response is activated, which is the T cells, but it also affects the humoral immunity as well. Notice that now the B cells and the T cells both have this receptor here that attaches to that antigen that was presented by the macrophage. That's how the T cell is going to recognize the antigens, the foreign cells, the foreign substances, and that's how the B cell is as well. Then they're going to go out and fight this infection, whatever it might be. T cells come in a couple different varieties. One is a cool sounding cell. These are called cytotoxic killer T cells. These are different than the natural killer cells that we saw before. The natural killer cells are part of the innate response. They're not the specific response we're talking about now, but they work in a similar way. So the cytotoxic T cells, they're specific to certain cells. They have the receptor for the certain antigens, and they go out and they find these cells, specific cells, and they basically kill these cells. It's kind of interesting way how this works. And the way they do this is by inserting toxic chemicals called perforin that will destroy the cell. So this is similar to putting holes in a cell as well. So whenever you damage the outside wall of a cell, it's not going to be able to survive again. So these killer T cells are crawling around looking for specific cells that have this antigen, and then they kill those cells. The helper T cells, on the other hand, these guys go out and they recruit other cells to help fight the invader. So we saw it in that picture just before, and they also interact with B cells, as you can see here. So here's our helper T cell. Here in the middle, it's going to interact with B cells, and it also brings more, activates T cells and brings other cells to the play as well. So let's watch a little animation now about how cytotoxic T cells work, and also helper T cells, how they function as well. You can see in this little picture here what's going to be happening. But we have a picture of a cytotoxic T cell coming and attaching to a disease cell or some sort of affected cell. It may be cancerous, it may be infected by viruses. It comes up to that cell, and this is a blow up here. So this is the cytotoxic T cell here with its membrane, and the other cell comes up and it's going to inject these perforins into the cell in order to destroy that cell.
Now let's look at how helper T cells aid cell-mediated immunity and humoral immunity. Imagine that bacteria have infected the body. Antigen molecules on their surfaces identify them as foreign. A macrophage engulfs an invader and breaks it into pieces. It displays the foreign antigen on its surface, along with a self-protein that acts as a label for the body's own cells. The macrophage is now an antigen-presenting cell. Helper T cells are key components in the immune response. There are many kinds of helper T cells, each with a unique kind of T cell receptor. Each receptor binds and responds to a particular self-non-self combination of antigen and self-protein, making the immune response highly specific. Binding of the T cell receptor to a particular antigen and self-protein activates the T cell. A chemical signal, interleukin-1, enhances this activation. The antigen-presenting cell secretes interleukin-1. Both interleukin-1 and contact with the antigen-presenting cells activate specific helper T cells to divide and grow into many cells with the same receptors. The helper T cells next activate other cells in the immune system by secreting another stimulatory protein, interleukin-2. Interleukin-2 stimulates helper T cells, cytotoxic T cells, and B cells. The helper T cells divide more rapidly and increase their stimulation of other cells. Cytotoxic T cells are stimulated to become active killer cells. B cells are stimulated to develop into plasma cells that secrete antibodies against the specific antigen.
So that's an overview of the cell-mediated response and how it affects the B cells, as well as it affects the humoral response as well. So let's review this one more time, how this all works with the aid of this diagram here. So we have our antigen that we're exposed to. On this side, notice we have the humoral, or the B cell, B lymphocyte response. Here we have the cellular mediated, or the T cell response. So this antigen directly activates B cells. It doesn't directly activate T cells as well. These have to be presented by infected cells in order to activate T cells. But B cells are directly activated, and then they'll go on to produce plasma cells and memory cells and antibodies in order to fight. Macrophages, which are crawling around the body, they will absorb the antigen, and then they will present it on their cell, on the outside of their cell, self and non-self. And then this is going to stimulate helper T cells, which then can stimulate the T cells to become cytotoxic T cells. And the helper T cells also stimulate B cells as well. So these B cells are stimulated in a number of ways, directly by the antigen or by the helper T cell. Cytotoxic T cell have to be activated by the antigen being presented on the outside of a cell. So as we continue here, now the B cell is going to produce plasma cells, which then produce the antibodies, which are going through the blood, attaching to the antigens and helping to fight that. It also produces memory cells. These memory cells are going to be important in if we ever come in contact with that antigen again. The T cells are going to give rise to active cytotoxic T cells, and they also activate or give rise to memory T cells. So we have two types of memory cells, memory T cells, memory B cells, and both of these are going to be active when we are exposed to the antigen again. And here we have our helper T cell again, still stimulating the B cells, the T cells, and also stimulating itself to produce more helper T cells. All of this is happening in order to fight off infection, to fight off antigens, and keep our body safe and secure. Very amazing process, very specific again to the type of antigen that we come in contact with. Both cell-mediated response and the humoral response are both very specific in this case. So in the last part of this section of the lecture, let's talk a little bit about both what can go wrong with an immune system, and then also dealing with trying to the transfer of grafts and also organ transplants and things like that. So this is a place where we've come a long way in the medical field, where today we're able to do a lot of grafts, we're able to transplant organs in order to save lives and a lot of things. And so grafts can come from a number of different places. First of all, there's what's called an autograft. So auto, think of self, and that's where an autograft comes from. So this is where you're taking tissue from the same person and transplanting it somewhere else on that person. In this case, there's not going to be an immune response because it's your own cells that are being used to transplant somewhere else. There's not going to be any immune response that's going to try to reject this sort of graft. There's also isografts. The isografts come from an identical twin, so someone that has the same genetics as you. Of course, not all of us have identical twins, and so the chance of having an isograft at this point is not really possible. But this is something interesting, because this is maybe a field where cloning comes into play. This is one of the major reasons why people want to do cloning, is for the medical benefits for the types of grafts and organ transplants, because we have the immune system. Someone that gets a transplant is going to be taking immunosuppressant drugs the rest of their life, unless they have the same genetics. Because if you have the same genetics, your body's not going to be able to differentiate between your cells and your identical twin cells. And so again, this is a type of graft or a type of organ transplant that is not going to be rejected, because it's just like it's your own. You have the same genetics. And so if you don't have an identical twin, cloning is a possibility, because with cloning in the future, and there's a lot of research being done with cloning, of course, in the future, if we can take your own DNA, put it into a cell, clone that cell, so that you can potentially produce organs or skin or cells that would have the same genetics as your cells. Here again, where there's not going to be any immune response, suddenly we're able to bypass the immune system. We're not going to have to worry about immunosuppressant drugs and these sorts of things. And so that's, although cloning individuals has a lot of controversy, this is one of the reasons why cloning is such a hot topic, is this idea here. There's also allografts. Allo meaning different. This is where you're getting tissue from an unrelated person, and this is where you're going to have trouble. Allografts, they try to match you up with someone that's as close as possible, very close genetics, so a family member. You have to check the blood type and all these different things, but you're still going to have to take immunosuppressant drugs throughout your life, because it's non-self. Your body, your immune system recognizes these cells as not your own. And so that's going to be a problem. And then there's xenografts, where you're taking tissue from an animal species. And there's a number of animal species they use, often pig valves. Pigs have very similar organs and genetics, and so those often are used. But again, you're still going to have immunosuppressant problems. You're going to have to take immunosuppressant drugs to try to dampen this immune system, because it's built to work very well. It's built to protect your body from foreign things, and that's what it's trying to do. We also have the problem of allergies, which we talked a little bit about, but I want to mention anaphylactic shock as well. And this is an immune response. This is when you're coming in contact with some sort of antigen and you're having a hypersensitive reaction to that. And this is triggered by the release of histamine, which you've seen before in this class, by IgE, which are types of antibodies. These are antibodies related to allergies. And they're causing this reaction, a very fast reaction that is powerful, and it can lead to death. So anaphylactic shock is very dangerous as your body's reacting inappropriately to some sort of antigen. So it's hypersensitivity. There's also delayed hypersensitivity. This is when this is a more delayed reaction, 1 to 3 days after contact with the antigen, and it's triggered by the release of lymphokines from helper T cells. And so in both cases here, we're having some sort of oversensitive reaction to some sort of antigen that's causing these allergies, which can, in the case of anaphylactic shock, can be very dangerous. In the case of other allergies, can just be somewhat annoying, I guess. There's also instances of immunodeficiency type syndromes. There's a number of things that can cause these. One of the most talked about and maybe dangerous ones at this point is AIDS. AIDS, acquired immunodeficiency syndrome. This is caused by an HIV virus. Now that we've talked about the immune system, about the lymphatic system, we mentioned a little bit about HIV. The reason this is such a dangerous disease is because HIV affects helper T cells inside your body. That's what this virus attacks. That's the type of cell it attacks. And so, as you can imagine, this is very dangerous, because if you have a virus attacking your immune cells, what better way to overcome or take over the body than to attack or infect the cells that are trying to protect the body. And so HIV is very effective in this way. Once you have HIV, your immune system is going to become depressed as you're losing these T cells to the virus, and this is what then leads to AIDS, acquired immunodeficiency syndrome. And AIDS is the actual syndrome caused by HIV. And what ends up happening is somebody with AIDS eventually doesn't die from HIV necessarily, indirectly from HIV, but they're going to die because their immune system has been suppressed, and so now they are suddenly subject to catching diseases that a normal healthy person wouldn't have to worry about with an active healthy immune system. So things that other people don't die from normally, now these people have a very dangerous condition where they can easily succumb to these other types of diseases. So very sad, very dangerous type of situation there. We also have what are called autoimmune diseases, and this is also an interesting thing, where the immune system, for some reason, is not able to, for some reason, mistakes self for non-self. So, in other words, the auto meaning your own, so your immune system is beginning to attack your own cells. And this is a very sad situation. There's a number of diseases that fall into this category, where your body is basically trying to destroy itself. Here's some examples of autoimmune disease. Multiple sclerosis. We talked about the nervous system. So this is where the white matter of brain and the spinal cord are being destroyed by the immune system. Myasthenia gravis. This is another situation where you have a breakdown of the nervous system control. Your immune system is fighting that. Type 1 diabetes. This isn't type 2 diabetes. This isn't adult onset or adult diabetes. This is sometimes called juvenile diabetes. This is type 1 diabetes mellitus. This is when your immune system destroys the pancreatic beta cells that produce insulin. And so that's why you're no longer able to produce insulin, and leads to all sorts of problems related to this. Rheumatoid arthritis, where your immune system is attacking your joints. Lupus. Lupus is a very disease. There's a number of different diseases that fall under this idea of lupus, or maybe a better way of saying is lupus can affect a lot of different parts of the body. But again, it's an autoimmune system. Your immune system is attacking different parts of your body. And then glomerulonephritis, which is where your immune system is attacking your kidneys. So all these diseases are very sad because this is a breakdown of the immune system where you're attacking your own body cells. So of course the question is, what leads to these autoimmune diseases? There's not really good answers to that, but there are some reasons why recognizing self breaks down. One is inefficient lymphocyte programming, where they're not being programmed correctly, and so they start attacking your own cells. Also, if proteins that your body for some reason hasn't seen before appear in your own tissues, this can compromise the immune system as well. So sometimes the eggs, the reproductive cells, eggs, sperm, cells in the islands that your body hasn't recognized as self before, proteins in thyroid glands show up and throws the immune system out of whack and causes all sorts of problems. Or there's situations where diseases such as rheumatic fever, where they mimic your own cells, your own proteins, and so your body suddenly can't tell the difference between the two and start to have problems in this way. So the immune system overall is an amazing system. It's been set up in order to protect our bodies, and in general it does a really good job. But there are situations where it'll break down, it's not working how it's supposed to, and that's where we get these autoimmune diseases and organ transplant problems and things like that. Alright, that's our lecture on the
lymph.